Welcome, everybody. Got a special treat now. We're going outside of America to get perspectives on inside of America. This is our continuing discussion with writers, professors, columnists, philosophers, activists, anybody left, right. We don't care. We want to get intelligent perspectives to you, the public, for you to make up your own mind. With us today is Jasper van Assche, assistant professor at the University Libre de Bruxelles. I believe that's the University of Bruxelles. Find out.
Yeah.
Postdoctorate research. I got it right. Postdoctorate research fellow at Ghent University. I know that one at least. Flemish region. Oh, you're in the Flemish region of Belgium.
Yep.
Okay. Interview with Jasper van Assche, professor, University of Bruxelles, Ghent. He's a full-time academic there. That's a picture of him. He's worked at the Center for Social and Cultural Psychology, ULB. He is a lecturer at the Center for Social and Cultural Psychology from 2019 to 2021. He was a postdoctorate research fellow at the Department of Developmental Personality and Social Psychology at the University of Ghent. That's a great university. He was also assistant academic staff in that same thing at the University of Ghent. Some of his research foci are intergroup relations, ethnic diversity, ideological climates, intergroup contact, and generalized prejudice. That's great because that's what we're going to be talking about today. Individual differences, authoritarianism, social dominance orientation, need for closure, religiosity, political attitudes, far-right party support. Yeah, we'll be getting into that. Voting behavior, we'll get into that. Political cynicism, we'll be getting into that. And populism, self-determination theory, basic psychology needs, well-being, etc. Big fan of self-determination theory. That's fascinating. He is an expert on how American elections are to be perceived outside of America and in Europe and in Brussels. And Brussels is, for everybody, home to the European Union. In American presidential elections, warmer weather on election days is favorable for the incumbent president or his party, says Jasper van Assche, the Department of Developmental Personality and Social Psychology. So Jasper is an expert on America, and he advises people in the administrative heart of the European Union about how to think about American elections. He's also talked about that. Today, we're talking to him about this article, came out in 2021, The Political Mindset of Supporters of Radical and Populist Parties. The term polarization makes us think of the ever-increasing contrast between the political left and right, with both left-wing and right-wing people becoming ever more radical. In this chapter, however, we argue that polarization is not an adequate framework to understand the supporters of radical and populist movements. Instead, moderates and radicals qualitatively differ in their political mindset, and this distinction is best captured by the concept of political cynicism. We also argue that the use of the new term populism to denote ideological attitudes of supporters of radical parties falls short, as it is superficial and contradictory. Hence, we conclude that radicals cannot be characterized as polarized moderates or as populists, but should be considered as political cynics instead. That's important. Radicals cannot be characterized as polarized moderates or as populists, but rather as political cynics instead. When we're looking at the extreme left and right, instead of people who are moderate and have been radicalized, what we should be looking at is people who have given up on belief of a fair American democratic system. So, did I get anything wrong? Is there something I need to correct? Was the record wrong on anything? Anything wrong with your bio at all, Professor?
Not at all. No, everything was perfect.
What is this study about? And why did you write it in 2021? Why did you think, this is the question I always ask people when I do academic studies. Why did you think this was a good idea in the year 2021 to do a study about this? What were you seeing? What were you experiencing? Why did it pop into your head going, oh, we need to look into this issue?
Yeah. Basically, it started from the observation that there were two trends in society. And maybe on a side note, the research that is discussed in this chapter is prominently from Western Europe. So we looked at Belgian and Dutch party support. But I think a lot of it will translate to the American context as well, to the US. But the two trends that we found or that we saw were, on the one hand, an increased support for radical populist parties, politicians, and ideas, and on the other hand, also a ideological polarization, which means that people tended to answer more extreme on certain issues. And so those two made it look like left and right wing adherents had nothing in common anymore. There was no shared ground, and basically this chapter was published in a book on political polarization. We were invited actually to discuss our research there together with my colleagues Alain Van Hiel and Tessa Hazevoets. And we started from that perspective, trying to discuss some of the research that we've done to see where does this come from? Where is the polarization coming from? How come that actually populist parties and politicians are so popular nowadays?
And you had looked at Belgium and the Dutch. I know with Belgium, you're looking at the Walloons versus the Flemish. Is that right? There's some sort of political division there in that region between those two
Yeah,
groups.
yeah. In fact, in those studies, we only looked in the north, in the Flemish region, among Dutch speaking participants, because actually in the south, in the Walloon or French speaking region, um, there are different parties that they can vote for. So
Right.
we only focused on the north because that's where all of us authors are from. But also, I think the advantage of looking at these two contexts, so we also look at the Netherlands, is that there's a lot of variety in parties. In the US, basically, there are more choices, but it comes down to two. In Belgium and the Netherlands, there's a variety, and parties can be put on a continuum from extreme left to extreme right, with everything in between. And this also helped us to figure out how can we actually distinguish those moderates from the more radicals.
Right. So, just for everybody following along at home, what he's talking about in America is we have a two-party system. Most of the planet's democracies that are in the Western order have what they call a multi-party system, or they have multi-party elections. Uh, the American system is called the winner-take-all system. It's seen as backwards compared to most of the rest of the world. Most of them have a multi-party system where parties have to work together to get a clear majority to form a governing mandate so that they can govern cohesively. What that results in is that a lot of countries have governments or coalition government that owns 65% of the vote. Here in America, we get a president who gets 51% and says, I have a mandate for the entire country. And it just causes all sorts of chaos. That's just the background for everybody. So you're looking at two different European countries, but you think the trends can be projected to other Western countries. I think what you're saying is people assume, oh, the left and the right are just getting more polarized from each other. They can't talk. And what you're saying, I think, is this isn't necessarily about conservatives and liberals getting more polarized. It's about more and more voters are just not believing the system is fair or works. And that causes them to take on these extreme behaviors. Is that roughly correct, sir?
Yeah, indeed. So basically, we started from the catastrophe model of political attitudes, which is a very famous model from the 90s, which tries to explain that actually, if people become more polarized or groups become more polarized, there's no more position overlap, and there's like a quantitative difference. Like people that would usually say a 7 on a scale from 1 extreme left to 10 extreme right would tend to say I become a 9. And on the other hand, people that would say I'm a 3 would rather say that they are a 1. And actually, the processes behind it is one cognitive process that you get persuaded by convincing arguments, but the other one is more a social perspective where you compare yourself with others, and by going to talk with like-minded people, by also seeking information from like-minded people, you have the desire to be liked, and this normative pressure also would give the floor towards more polarization. So this is more extremism would be considered as a step-by-step evolution, which actually breaks down the consensus into two separate streams that are deviating from mainstream thought. And basically, we showed in our research that that's not entirely true, because two things should be clear. One is that you would have two separate groups, and two is that within those groups, people would be fairly similar. And for none of it, we found evidence. For example, Alain Van Heel, the first author on this paper, he found that actually among people that are party members, like from extreme parties, both extreme left and extreme right, there was no consensus in the values that they found important. They actually varied dramatically in terms of openness, conformity, adherence to security, or importance attached to security. And also, there was a Dutch political scientist showing that populist parties tend to be ideologically poor, and they tend to select left and right recipes as they see fit, which would also not match well with the fact that you could easily distinguish moderates from radicals by using right-wing attitudes. And in the follow-up,
Real quick, before you go on,
Hmm?
just to back up what the professor's saying, that is exactly what happened with Donald Trump. Donald Trump came in here and everybody said, oh, he's a populist and he's an extreme right winger. And then he'd say things that you only saw on the left. So, and a lot of Republicans didn't like him because Trump would take ideas from the left and the right and then merge it together and just go, no, this is the right way. He was famous for doing that. So please continue. But I wanted to point out that in America, what the professor's saying, you literally saw that dynamic happen with Trump. So please continue, Professor.
Yeah, in a study I conducted with an American colleague, Tom Pettigrew, we also found that indeed right-wing attitudes were related to support for Donald Trump, but above and beyond that, anti-immigration attitudes, for example, were a big factor too. So it's always important to take into account more than just the two classical conservative dimensions, social, cultural, and economic hierarchical. You have to look at fault lines or demarcations that also explain variation beyond or above the two classical ones. And in the research then that we conducted here, we not only found that there were differences and that they were predicted by some of our fault lines, but actually cynicism was the most important one. What does that mean? It's a profound negative attitudes towards the establishment and a lack of trust, but it goes even deeper than that. It's very antagonistic. It's related to perceived hypocrisy, disrepute towards politics and politicians, very antagonistic, and is contempt, and is driven by anger and active hostility. So we found that this was the best predictor of being far left or far right compared to being in the center as a moderate. So for us, it became clear that the abyss between moderates and radicals is more about being in or out of the political system than it is about being left or right, or extreme left or extreme right. So this is basically what we found. And then, of course, we looked at specific parties. If you look at, for example, the radical right in Belgium and the Netherlands, we see that not only is political cynicism and anti-establishment sentiment important, but above and beyond that, ethnic prejudice is also an attitude that can explain a lot of the support for radical right rhetoric, which is, of course, driven by certain discourses that you can find. For the radical left, then, we found another pull factor, namely anti-globalization and anti-capitalism. So basically, the reason why, or one of the reasons why extremes become more and more popular is because there are a lot of themes in society where they can feed upon, and when they can use actually to mobilize people in the center to become more in favor of one of the extremes.
Couple questions,
Mm-hmm.
if I may.
Sure.
So I understand you're not an American, you're not in America, and we're asking you to project a study that was based upon two European countries onto America. So I get it. So folks, this is not exactly the same. This is going to be a lot of interpretation, acknowledging that. getting that acknowledged. I do want to ask you about it because I find that people who are outside the situation often have interesting perspectives. I've talked to a lot of people who have traveled. I live in California. We have a lot of immigrants. We have a lot of people who live in other countries and travel here. And I always find their perspective of America to be incredibly enlightening. What's that phrase? The frog in the pot of boiling water doesn't
Yeah.
know it's being boiled. It takes another frog outside of the pot of boiling water to see that that frog's being boiled and go, hey, you're being boiled.
Yeah.
So there's just that. Not saying one frog's smarter than the other, but perspective has a lot to do with this. Napoleon, Lincoln, Hitler, Jesus were all on the outside of the major societies that they created a vision for that was radically informative and changing for them. Some good, some bad. Okay, here's the thing I want to get to. Political cynicism seems to equal radicalism. Okay. Now, we're having a lot of division here in America. And some people say, well, it's not as bad as the 1960s. So in the 1960s in America was considered a very radical period in America. In American history, there was a lot of turmoil and conflict, and people consider that was another time where Americans almost tore themselves apart as a country. Some people are saying the difference between the 1960s and now is it was very radical in the 60s. You did have more actual violence, police stations being bombed, other military recruiting stations being bombed, etc. But the difference was that in the 1960s, everybody believed in the authority of Congress, the Supreme Court, the presidency, the election system. Now in America, we have the lowest amount of faith in every single form of the government except for the military. So they've done a lot of studies. The only things Americans feel faith in is the U.S. military. They have the lowest amount of faith in about half a century in Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court, you name it.
Mm-hmm.
In the 1960s, that wasn't there. People, as much as they hated each other, had a common belief in these systems. Now we hate each other just as much, and we have no common core, no common belief system. For example, in the 1960s, the left did not say, I don't think Nixon won, and so we're going to deny that he won an election for the next 4 years. And then the right didn't say, I don't think your guy won, and so I'm going to deny that he's a legitimate president for 4 years. They didn't have anything like that. And now you do. And what that means is that people think that this situation could be more dangerous than the 1960s because there is no common institutions to hold us together. Now I'm hearing about your model. Political cynicism is the number one projector of becoming a radical. Well, cynicism is based upon you don't really believe the system works right or for you. So we're entering this period where you got a lot of Americans don't believe the system works, don't believe democracy is functional, don't believe it's fair, doubt the other side. Is it fair to say that when we look at that, based upon your research, that we might be in a worse situation now in America than we were in the 1960s?
That's a very good question, and I can echo some of the things that you said because I looked up some interesting facts. For example, the Pew Research Center measures political trust and trust in politics and politicians over the years. I'll tell you the percentage of Americans who trusted the government in 1958 and then again in 2007. It dropped from 73%, so 3 out of 4 in the end of the 50s, up until 30% in 2007. So that's a dramatic decline. Also, they measure Ipsos Global Trust polls. They measure each year what people think is the least trustworthy profession. I think it used to be a car salesperson. Now it became politician.
Yes. Used car salesperson, notorious, least trustworthy. Yes.
Yeah, and now it's politician. So people
Oh
really.
my, can you say that one more time? Can you say that one more time?
Yeah, so politician is considered nowadays to be the least trustworthy profession, or at least in 2019, which is the latest data that I could get a hold on. So you could say that traditional politics are considered the major force behind this disinterest, this indifference, and the sentiment that there's no more overlap between the extremes. And I think a lot of voters also want to electorally punish those traditional parties and politicians. Um, so it's a big crisis. You might say it's a cynicism pandemic. Now the question remains: are cynical people really anti-democratic, and are they presenting a threat to the current political system, or can they also act as messengers of political change that eventually will benefit democracy? I think the answer might be both, a little bit of both. Although we must be aware, of course, of toxic radicalism and disinformation that goes along with certain extreme rhetorics. But of course, the question remains: how can we overcome this crisis? And this is a question that is very valid nowadays in Europe, but also in the US. I think we must bridge the trust divide again, and the population and the government must get along again. I think it will not be an easy task, and I think the counter reaction against this radicalism should come from the traditional parties themselves. Um, what I mean by that, and it's one of the questions I think here.
We've
That
answered almost all of them except for this one, which you're getting
Yeah,
into now.
yeah. Well, I think we shouldn't ignore the concerns of radical voters. It's a signal. It's a message that they're sending out. So topics such as immigration, such as globalization, such as climate change, such as health issues are important. And I think one of the mistakes that the traditional politicians and political parties have made is that they kind of pushed aside political cynics. And for example, Macron, but also Hillary Clinton used the term deplorables to refer to a certain group, which wouldn't help getting into contact again and getting towards a common position overlap to start at least a conversation. So I think one of the solutions might be apologizing for wrongdoings, admitting that traditional politics haven't worked as they used to, or not as much as people wanted them to. And I think what you can see, at least in Belgium, for example, is that certain political parties are simply copy pasting the pamphlets of the extremes. That, for example, center parties are now focusing on migration as a important topic. That
Mhm.
certain, let's say, moderately left parties are taking away anti-capitalism rhetorics from the extreme left. I think this will further divide the traditional parties, and you explained it very well. In Europe, with our complex system, parties need to get along and they need to form a coalition at some point. If they don't cooperate, then they will remain powerless. And
You'll have government that works as well as we do over here. You don't want that. That's
uh,
where it's going. Yeah, you don't. Because we're about, people are talking about, are we going to collapse our economy because the two sides can't agree on a debt refinancing ceiling? I mean, it is a stupid conversation for a country to have. Country shouldn't even have that country. We're doing this for our sixth time, I think, in the
mhm,
last 15 years. So
yeah.
not good. I remember when Obama was president and the Republicans were there, and people thought polarization was bad then during Obama. And what you had was you had a standoff over refinancing the debt. And it got so bad that the World Bank criticized both Obama and the Republicans and said the entire American government looks like a bunch of children. Because you're fighting over your debt, and maybe you guys don't realize this, but America's a big part of the global economy. And when you do that, it scares financial markets around the planet. You don't just screw things up for yourself. And so the World Bank spanked both of them. Now we're back to doing it for, I think, the third or fourth time since we got that warning. Like we didn't learn nothing, as they say back where I'm from. Let me ask you a question. So some of the politicians need to recognize they did wrong, demonizing radicals. Are you saying that Hillary Clinton needs to come back and say on national television, hey, folks, when I called you guys deplorables, I was wrong, and I shouldn't have done that, and my bad, and we need to come together as Americans? Is that an example of the behavior that you're saying is a way out?
I think this could be part of the solution, at least listening to people's concerns. rather than just marginalizing them. Um, it's a very specific example, of course, and I'm not too familiar with the US context or what
Sure.
exactly Hillary Clinton said, but I think the Democratic Party in general, and maybe also Republican Party, can apologize for some of the wrongdoings, and they can try to reconnect at least, because I think depolarization is needed for moderate voters, and maybe even resocialization is needed for radical voters, welcoming them back into the system instead of pushing them out where they will either not vote or vote for extreme alternatives.
So the current president of America is Joseph R. Biden. He did something that no American president had ever done before in 200 years. He had a speech, and it was live on television with a blood red backdrop. That's never been done for American presidents. He also had active duty Marines standing behind him. That's not typical either. And then he seemed to say that everybody who supported Donald Trump was an enemy of the government. In fact, his speech was so controversial that the entire right side of America took it as though the president just said 78 million Americans are enemies of the state. Members of his own party and independents said, damn, that is some extreme language. Is that the kind of behavior that calms down radicalism or makes it even worse?
In my opinion, it would only stir up the anger in that part of the voting
Wow.
population.
Oh,
Um,
huh.
yeah, I think
Wow.
it's easy to
Interesting.
say, but regaining trust is necessary. Um, and blaming people will probably not be the best solution there.
So maybe Biden should come forward and say, hey, when I appeared to call 78 million Americans enemies of the state, language typically reserved for ISIS and a Russian nuclear strike, my bad. I probably shouldn't have done that. I should have been more willing to talk with you guys instead of just name call and demonize you.
Yeah, yeah. If I remember correctly, he did like a couple of days after being elected say that he would be the president of all of Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to create like some sort of overarching inclusive identity.
Yep,
Um,
he did. He
yeah.
did. And then he did his speech after that,
Okay.
where he
Yeah.
said 78 million Americans are, quotes, basically enemies of the state, language reserved for terrorists like who killed 3,000 Americans in New York or the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Pretty strong. And
Yeah.
it terrified all of the right, and it actually terrified some of his own party. And so I'm wondering, I'm just asking you, since you're a researcher, it
Mhm.
sounds like you're saying that is the total opposite of the kind of language that you would need to calm things down.
Yeah. I think it reflects a little bit of what I was talking about earlier about copy pasting the certain discourse of radical right, for example. It sounds almost as if Donald Trump would have said such words or used such terms. So yeah, I think it's not the best solution in my opinion, and based on our results.
Um, so what happens if people don't apologize? They never come back. They just kind of leave it out there, and tough. You don't like it. There's the article, by the way. That was a little bit of the
Okay.
picture
Yeah.
of that, and he actually terrified independents and Democrats. I remember CBS TV or NBC had to do discussions with Biden officials where they were like, "Do you think that was a good idea on TV?" Which you don't normally see. What happens if we don't do this? Nobody walks it back. Hell no! I said it. I meant it. And here's the other thing: is that when I brought this up to people about Joseph Biden's speech, I have seen people on the left say, "Not hardcore enough."
Mm.
And I go, but he scared 78 million Americans. He scared the entire side of the right. He scared members of his own party. He scared independents. And I've seen people on the left say, who cares? Not hardcore enough. He should have been more hardcore. What
Mhm.
happens in a future of America where things like this from Joseph Biden are actually more hardcore, and really the only voice he's listening to is the people saying, go more hardcore. Let's not be nice to those MAGA supporters. Let's really give it to them. And there is no apology. There is no backing down. We just see this kind of attitude continue and ramp up even more. Good sign or bad sign for the future of America, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think it's a sign that there's also a lot of variation in each of the two parties, and I think that's the one of the disadvantages of a two-party system is that even within the party, people tend to have a variety of opinions and not always get along on a certain point. Um, you asked me like, what do political cynics then do if they're out of the system? I think there are two ways that they can react. One is not do anything because they think that action would be futile and they think the ship is already sunk anyway. So they would leave the political system and not go to vote. Or probably because they can also only vote for small marginal parties. An exception is when the elections are at high stake. Then I think they can add political weight and they can actually be game changers. And what happened, for example, in 2013 in the Italian elections is a nice reflection of that, where two of the populist parties, the Five Star Movement and the
Five
Lega Nord,
star. Yeah.
they became very popular in the polls, and people, the political cynics there, thought, okay, we can really make a difference here, and they turned out to be very politically efficient, or yeah, they became important political forces, which I think reflects a little bit what could happen in the US, that a new or old populist politician comes back with a certain rhetoric that mobilizes people because they think that he or she can make a difference.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, we've gone over the study. You've covered that. Gone over what happens if it doesn't get better. Gone over what we should be doing. I'm running out of questions. You've been awesome. This has been just really laser focused and straightforward with the information. Okay, let's go. I'll ask you the question that I typically ask guests towards as we're winding down.
Mhm.
You're not from America, but you are talking on a show that primarily Americans are going to watch.
Mhm.
Although this is available for everybody in the world. I want you to picture yourself as somebody who's outside of your body. You know, you're not you, you're not me, you're a third person watching this video. And it's 5 days from now. 5 days from now. It's Monday, it's maybe like Friday, Saturday. And you're this third person, and you're saying to yourself, you know, I watched this interview with this Brussels professor, and he was pretty great. And I don't remember everything, but there was this one thing that he said towards the interview, and you know, I can't get that out of my head. What is that thought that you would want an average unknown person watching this video to not be able to get out of their head 5 days from now, Professor?
I think it's the open-ended question that we also asked ourselves: how can we regain trust in the political system?
Hmm. Oh, okay. Well, there you go. That's a first. That's a first. So people normally give these long-winded answers. He gave a question back to you to make you think. I like that. I like that. You're the first one to do that. Well, I have a question for you. Okay. Is there any questions for us? Anything you'd like to cover? Any parts of discussion you think that we should discuss to make sure people understand this correctly, or anything we missed?
No, I think I was able to explain in detail all of the nuances that we tried to uncover with our chapter. And we had an interesting discussion also on how a lot of it could be translated to the US context. So I want to thank you again for the invitation. It was a great experience from my side.
Well, thank you, everybody. This has been kind of a straightforward interview. I got to say, you're very direct, and it's kind of awesome to get right to it. So we had a really good conversation. You understood this research, and I think it's important for everybody to recognize that what you're saying. Polarization may not just be because you heard some more radical idea. It might be because people fundamentally don't believe in the system anymore. And that doesn't get fixed until people have faith in a common system.
Indeed. Yeah.
We'll leave it there. Professor, if you know anybody else who'd be willing to be part of a discussion about polarization in America, I will email you a copy of the video in a few hours. If you have any names, please send it to us. We would love to invite them out.
I'll do that.
Okay, thank you. I'll see you soon. I'll email you in a couple hours.
All right, perfect. Have a good day.